Alright, so after by far the longest hiatus that any series on my channel has ever taken, not that I have all that many series on my channel that were even kind of regular to begin with, we're getting back to Yu-Gi-Oh! Reviews of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Manga specifically. Finally moving on to the parts of the manga that were actually adapted for the Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters / Yu-Gi-Oh! In the dub anime. This is the section of the story that most of you guys, especially those of you who never even picked up a volume of the manga, are going to be most familiar with. But I promise you, there are differences between these manga chapters and whatever version of the story you've seen. So it is still worth watching these reviews. I think, in fact, I find the differences, especially the differences between the manga and the dub, but all of them, to be pretty interesting. First of all, because the first episode of the anime adapted the climax to the Death Tea arc, which we obviously got in the manga a little while back, no version of that episode appears here at the beginning of this arc of the manga. Instead, we're referred back to that arc of the manga and that duel that took place when Yugi and his friends discuss the fact that Kaiba still hasn't woken up from the coma-like state that the other Yugi put him in after defeating him. If you haven't read those chapters of the manga, it's actually worth going back and reading them or going and watching my review of that specific duel. But just to paraphrase, and I kind of feel like I need to since the anime never really goes into much detail about what happened during all of that, what the other Yugi actually did to Kaiba after all of that, since it only had one episode to adapt the climax to an entire arc. Anyway, Kaiba put Yugi and his friends through hell. Death Tea was a literal death game that he forced them to fight through, with multiple stages, any one of which could have been fatal. The final death game being the game of Duel Monsters that we see adapted into the first episode of the anime. After which, the other Yugi, in the very first incident where Yugi and the other Yugi knowingly worked together, saw that there was a darkness inside of Kaiba, but that inherently he wasn't a bad person. So he used the penalty game Mind Crush to break Kaiba's psyche into pieces so that he would have to put it back together over time, hopefully building himself up into a better person in the process. This serves as a major turning point for the other Yugi, as until fairly recently he had seemed kind of like a vengeful spirit who comes out to avenge Yugi whenever he's wrong. But we can see here that he's a genuinely good person who sees that Kaiba, while definitely being responsible for what he did, isn't entirely responsible for what he did. Circumstances have made him into a worse person than he would be otherwise. And he shows Kaiba compassion and forgiveness, giving him a chance to be better. And we see in this opening to the arc that Yugi also has compassion for Kaiba. He's been going to see him in the hospital, checking up on him. So he knows that Kaiba still hasn't recovered. He still hasn't woken up yet. And this is all spurred on by the fact that there's a Duel Monsters tournament going on TV right now. For some reason, it's a fairly local tournament, one that Yugi could have entered in and swept pretty easily because he's Yugi. But he doesn't want to actually compete in another official event until doing so would give him the chance to compete against Kaiba, the new Kaiba, in a fair duel. He officially sees Kaiba as, at the very least, a rival. This coupled with the very opening scene of the arc where Anzu, of all people, defeats Jinochi at a game of Duel Monsters using just the absolute worst cards that somehow made it into the official game, despite the fact that they're all terrible. All of this together serves to remind us of Duel Monsters, even though it hasn't been that terribly long in the manga since we've seen it. But it reminds us of Duel Monsters, reminds us of the events that have happened around Duel Monsters up to this point, and also kind of gets us reacquainted with some of the rules, though what happens next does a better job of that than anything else. But it's important, at the very least, to get us reacquainted with Duel Monsters pretty quickly here, since this is the point in the story where the manga shifts to be primarily about the card game. There are other games slipped in there, here and there, and they are sometimes the best aspects of the manga during this period, but it's mostly about the card game going forward. In fact, it becomes so about the card game that Kazuki Takahashi even weaves the myths and the backstories that he was building up around the other Yugi into the card game itself. Characters from the card game end up being retroactively revealed to be characters from that backstory. It's super interesting, but it stinks of something that he never planned for. Something that wasn't his original intention, and that's because it wasn't. Duel Monsters was just the game that he created for his manga that got the biggest reaction from fans. The first adaptation of the manga into anime form, the Season 0 anime, which adapted loosely the pre-Duelist stuff from the manga, also recognized that Duel Monsters was the most marketable and the best realized game that Takahashi had created, and even went so far as to add more Duel Monsters stuff to the story that wasn't there before. That fan response to Duel Monsters, coupled with the fact that they wanted to do another anime adaptation, but one focused on Duel Monsters, got Takahashi to shift the focus of the story to being primarily about the card game. Something that he doesn't seem to regret, though I'm really curious to see what Yu-Gi-Oh! Would have become if that hadn't happened. And not that I hate the card game or anything, I quite like the card game, but still, it's interesting to think about, right? Anyway, we get to see the finals of that tournament on TV, because again, they're showing it on TV for some reason, and it's between Dinosaur, Ryuzaki, and Insector Haga, who of course use Dinosaur and Insect decks respectively. And Ryuzaki is of course very straightforward. He runs right into Haga's trap and gets beaten down by a much smaller insect and loses in one turn somehow because of this. Doesn't really make a lot of sense. In fact, nothing about the duel is explained at all. We're giving the base attack points of the monsters that they play, the two-headed King Rex and the basic insect, and we're told generally what the spells and traps that they play do, but I have no idea how Haga won at all. But this is good. This not only serves to give us a quick taste of the different kinds of strategies that can be utilized in Duel Monsters, but it also serves to introduce us to Haga and Ryuzaki, who are going to be recurring characters later on, and it gives us our first look at Maximilian Pegasus, or Pegasus Crawford, depending on which version you're watching / reading. The American industrialist who created the game of Duel Monsters in the first place, and who crowns the winner of the tournament, so that we know who he is when, not too long from now, Yugi receives a package with an 8mm video camcorder tape, a gauntlet with star-shaped holes, and 2 star-shaped chips inside of it. Yugi plays the 8mm tape, and the image of Pegasus comes up on the TV, wanting to challenge him to a duel, despite the fact that that's physically impossible. But Yugi agrees, and Pegasus seems to be anticipating what Yugi will say, compelling him to take 5 minutes to build a deck there in front of the TV. And then they duel, and Pegasus is able to anticipate and react to his moves. He also continues to talk back to Yugi whenever Yugi says anything. And that, coupled with the fact that one of his monsters is actually stolen by the trap card Dragon Capture Jar, leads Yugi to realize that this is a shadow game, that he has come against another Millennium enemy. So the other Yugi comes out mid-game to continue the duel for his smaller counterpart. He and Pegasus duel back and forth, but Pegasus is still able to set the perfect traps to counter any move that the other Yugi makes, leading the other Yugi to realize that he somehow knows what cards the other Yugi is going to play. This leads him to hypothesize that there are subliminal images hidden within the tape, compelling Yugi to play certain monsters, and the video of Pegasus responds to this as if that's correct, only to then go on and show that that's not actually how he was doing what he was doing, that he can just straight up see what's in the other Yugi's hand and respond to it in real time. despite the fact that he's a pre-recorded tape. And he goes on to steal Yugi's Dark Magician, use it against him, and then win the duel by default when Yugi's not able to defeat him in the time remaining on the tape. As a penalty, he then takes the soul of Yugi's grandpa, trapping it on the tape, so that he can use freeing grandpa as leverage to get Yugi to come to Pegasus' private island and compete in a tournament that he's holding there. And I kind of both love and hate this duel, because while the interactions between Pegasus and both Yugis in this duel gives us a fantastic sense of his personality, and I find Pegasus to be a very entertaining character and just villain in general. This duel also makes absolutely no sense at all, even a little bit. First of all, let's talk very briefly about the whole subliminal imaging thing. I hate this, the anime, or at least the dub of the anime. I'm not sure if the Japanese version did this or not, but the dub, at the very least, just ignores the whole subliminal imaging thing, at least as far as I can remember. I don't remember that being in the anime at all. And I understand why that's the case, because it's absolutely batshit stupid. I understand that at this point, there's supposed to be a limited card pool that most players have access to, but Yugi lives in a card shop. He's going to have a bigger card pool than most people. He's not just going to have a bucket of commons that he pulls from, right? So there is absolutely no way that Pegasus could have known what cards he was going to have on hand to build his deck with, so that he would know what subliminal images to put in there in the first place. And even then, he would have had to have known that Yugi had drawn those cards in order to be able to subliminally compel him to use them when he did. It just doesn't make sense. It's not possible that he did that. And I don't think he did. I think Yugi was wrong. I think Pegasus just went along with Yugi's assessment there in order to lull him into a false sense of security or something. That the entire time he really was just using the power of his Millennium Eye, the mind scan, to read what was in Yugi's hand and react to it that way. I think that somehow, rather than somehow predict all of this and pre-record the tape, he did something similar to what we've seen Bakura do, and put a piece of himself on that tape. We already know that he can put souls into things like cards and tapes, so why not put an image of his soul, or a piece of it, or a reflection of it, or something onto a tape so that he can communicate with Yugi over great distances, and also have a tape on hand to trap Yugi's grandpa in. Assuming that that's what he did, and that he was just using his bullshit magic powers the whole time rather than some subliminal imaging trick, makes so much sense than the subliminal imaging trick. Like, the only reason I can think of that he would try to trick Yugi into thinking that he wasn't using mind reading powers to predict Yugi's moves was so that he could keep the powers of his Millennium Eye under wraps for the time being, so as not to show his hand early. But then he just straight up tells Yugi that it was his Millennium Eye that let him do all this in the first place. It's a needless complication that serves no purpose except to pad this duel out for just a little while and give Yugi a little pseudo-win partway through the battle. And I kind of hate it a lot, and it makes me dislike what otherwise would have been a really interesting matchup. I also kind of hate that this specifically is the duel that they use to reacquaint us with the rules of Duel Monsters, because one of the things that we're introduced to here is elemental weaknesses, something that the anime barely bothered to adapt at all, because they just kind of stopped caring about it after the start of this arc, and nobody ever talks about it again, unless Jinochi needs to pull a win out of his ass against a bunch of water attribute monsters with an electric sword or something. So rather than get a good back and forth duel that's going to represent the kinds of duels that we're going to be seeing moving forward, mostly without this stupid elemental weakness rule, we get one that's punctuated with reminders of this elemental weakness rule that means practically nothing. It's kind of like something else that we're introduced to early on in the actual tournament. The fact that only flying monsters or monsters with ranged abilities can fight other flying monsters. Kind of like in Magic the Gathering, which is a detail that literally only matters when it matters. Most of the time they ignore it unless, again, Jinochi needs to pull a cool move out of his butt. But still, you can tell that Kazuki Takahashi was kind of fumbling to flesh out this game in the first place. That, again, he hadn't really ever planned for this game to take over the whole manga, so he's mostly just trying to filler it with different rules and tactics that might be interesting for him to use later on. So it makes sense that some of this stuff never really shows back up again. Like, it's annoying that it doesn't, but I understand why. He basically, it feels like he kind of had to rush this out. He had to kind of rush the complete rules to Duel Monsters out for the start of this arc, and they didn't really pan out the way that he hoped that they would, if that makes sense. So I forgive it, it's just annoying. And weirdly enough, because of the stuff that I didn't like about this duel, it ends up being one of the few duels, or the few anythings really, in the entire run of this franchise, where I actually prefer the anime version over the manga version. I prefer the version without the stupid subliminal imaging thing. I prefer the version where they don't dwell on the elemental matchup aspect. But at the same time, there's something about this duel that I like a lot better in the manga. I like that the video that Pegasus sent Yugi was on an 8mm tape. It was on just a regular video cassette in the anime. Because the fact that Yugi's grandpa is trapped on an 8mm camcorder tape means that Yugi can put it into a camcorder with a screen and still talk to Grandpa. He can still be a character. Like, yeah, it's a thing that they eventually stopped bothering with, only bringing it back up towards the end of the arc, so I understand why the anime didn't bother to adapt it. But the anime didn't even bother to adapt it, and I thought it was a fun little detail. I wish it had been in the anime. Instead, in the anime, his grandpa is just put onto a card. Meanwhile, a day passes. I have no idea where Grandpa's body is supposed to be in the meantime. Don't ask. And Yugi and the other Yugi both get moments where they dedicate themselves to taking Pegasus's challenge, even though they don't want to duel in a tournament again until they can duel Kaiba, because they have to save Grandpa. Because of course they're going to do that. Because of course they have to save him, right? And I like that they both get scenes which convey this. I like that they're both being treated as valid characters by this point, something that the anime didn't do, because since, again, the anime didn't adapt Death Tea, they had to wait and give us a similar moment where the two Yugis came to start working together much later on in the story, which I think robbed the story of a lot of nuance. We also get a brief scene here with Bakura where we find out that even though he doesn't wear it anymore, he still has the Millennium Ring, and that he would like to know more about the Millennium items and their connection with ancient Egypt, which is not important for now, but will be important later. But anyway, just in time for them to have made this decision, they get another package. An envelope taped to the door of the card shop containing 5 cards. One which shows a boat with a date and time, one which shows the Duelist Kingdom Island, one which shows the gauntlet that came in the original package and explains what it is, that it holds star chips, explaining that any duelist in the tournament must have a star chip on their wrist in order to keep competing. But most importantly, it contains the 2 cards. They have different names in the manga. I know them as Glory of the King's Hand and Glory of the King's Opposite Hand. In order to compete in the finals of the tournament, a duelist will have to have one of these 2 cards at least, and if they win the tournament, they will be able to cash one or both of them in. The Glory of the King's Hand representing wealth and earning them a vast monetary prize, whereas Glory of the King's Opposite Hand earns them the chance to duel Pegasus. Meanwhile, Jinochi has just gotten, surprise, surprise, an 8mm camcorder tape in the mail. He thinks that he's going to be invited to the tournament too, even though he sucks at the game. But instead it's just a video from his younger sister. He and the sister have kind of a Matt and TK from Digimon thing going on, where one of them lives with the dad and one of them lives with the mom. And they don't see each other much, and his sister is just so innocent and adorable. It's obvious, even before she says anything and Jinochi says anything about her, that something bad is going to happen to her. Or, at the very least, something bad might happen to her if the characters don't swoop in and save her at the last second, right? She just has that feel to her. And it turns out that she's always had problems with her eyes, and they're getting worse as of late. And she is going to go blind before she sees Jinochi again. And because she had hoped to see him again and can't, she at the very least wanted to talk to him and tell him, even if just through this tape. So now Jinochi has a reason to fight too, to get the prize money, so Yugi gives him Glory of the King's Hand and one of the 2 star chips he received, so that Jinochi can compete in the tournament alongside him and try to win the prize money. And I love this as a storytelling device, because the tournament doesn't start for another week, which gives Yugi plenty of time to train Jinochi and get him to a point where he's competent at the game, so that we can see him grow from a level of base competence as the arc progresses. This gives us a character who's already pretty much an expert at the game, and a character who doesn't know much, which is so much fun, because those are 2 distinct kinds of protagonists, appealing to distinct kinds of tastes. But this also creates a fantastic tension. The characters involved in the tournament, every single one of them will now be starting from a position of power over Yugi and Jinochi, despite the fact that Yugi beat the world champion already. Like, they needed a way for Yugi to start the tournament from a position of disadvantage, and this is a fantastic way of going about it. Other characters who have 2 star chips from the start can knock Yugi out with a single duel with practically no risk to themselves, because even if they lose, they'll only have to bet 1 star chip against his. Meanwhile, Yugi can't eliminate anyone unless he can compel them to bet all of their star chips against his 1. Not to mention the fact that because Yugi beat the world champion, that being Kaiba of course, in a very public forum, everyone knows who he is. They're going to want the clout that comes from beating him. And if he seems so much weaker to start than everyone else, they're going to be coming for him. It's fantastic. But at the same time, Kazuki Takahashi does something really ingenious here. So ingenious, in fact, that I'm not even sure he planned it. But, think about it for a second. His 2 protagonists, Yugi and Jinochi, both seem to be in a position of disadvantage. But one of them is the main character. So he's not going to get eliminated immediately. That's just not going to happen. It doesn't make sense from a storytelling standpoint for that to happen. And by putting both Yugi and Jinochi into the tournament, he's effectively given both of them 2 chances to accomplish their goal. Because of course, if Jinochi wins, he's still going to give Yugi the Glory of the King's opposite hand so that he can cash it in to fight Pegasus. But if Yugi wins, he's still going to give Jinochi Glory of the King's hand so that he can cash it in for the money, which he would then be able to go on to use to pay for an operation for his sister to fix her eyesight. If you think about it for more than 30 seconds, it's obvious that that's what would happen if the 2 of them became enemies in the finals of this tournament, and yet it creates the illusion that not only are both of them at a starting disadvantage, but they will eventually have to come against each other should they both make it far enough, and that one of them might have to crush the other one's dream. I cannot stress enough how ingenious this is as a plot device. It's just chef's kiss beautiful. Anyway, all of that said, let's talk very briefly about the 5th chapter in this arc, the final chapter that I'm going to be talking about in this review. This one just shows the trip from the docks in Domino City to the Duelist Kingdom for the most part. Anyway, we jump to Duelist Kingdom at the start of the next chapter. Giving us a little bit of downtime on the ship as it's in transit over the night to get to know some of the other players in this thing. First of all, Ryuzaki and Haga are both going to be participating, and we know straight up that they're both dangerous opponents. We also get a better feel for their personalities here. They, as people, seem very much like they are as players. Ryuzaki is very straightforward. Haga is very strategic and soft-spoken and considerate. Like, not considerate in that he considers the feelings of others, but considerate in that he considers things carefully, if that makes sense. It's also hinted to the audience through some dialogue between Yugi and Haga that there's going to be new rules on the island, which are going to make things more strategic. And while we're never told exactly what those rules are, we do know at the very least that they account for some of the more interesting interactions between the duel monsters and their environments during duels that take place during the tournament. And so a lot of fans have headcanoned these rules to be the reason that some of the more outlandish, realistic interactions between duel monsters that we see throughout the arc are able to happen. We also meet Mai Kujaku, who is a sexy femme fatale, followed everywhere by the scent of expensive perfume, who causes all the men to swoon and the Anzu to go batshit crazy, and who is apparently conniving and skilled enough to completely humiliate Ryuzaki, putting her at a power level comparable to Haga, who is the current Duel Monsters champion. And I end up liking these little interactions between Yugi and Jinochi and their friends and these other antagonists quite a lot. They give these people a lot of character right off the bat. Though, I resent this chapter a little bit because I kind of hate what they do with Haga from this point forward. During this chapter, he's portrayed as a kid who considers strategy and critical thinking to be more important than his interpersonal relationships. Someone who is cold and calculating, but at the end of the day, isn't a bad person, to the point that he even seems so concerned with being on an even playing field with his opponents that he tips Yugi off to the new rules that he's heard rumors about. And while there is that infamous scene on the deck of the ship where he tricks Yugi into letting him see the 5 pieces of Exodia so that he can throw them off the ship, causing Jinochi to jump into the water after them, only to recover, I think, like 2 of the 5 or something, like a frickin' idiot. And while this is definitely presented as devious and wrong, and he is definitely cheating here by eliminating one of the win conditions from one of his rivals' decks, he never comes across as an evil person because of it. He comes across as someone who believes in his strategy above all things, and who literally couldn't come up with a better strategy to beat a card which causes an instant win when used in a deck driven by a competent duelist. A card which could be considered cheating in its own right, as it bypasses the rules in order to claim victory. And like, it was definitely necessary for somebody to do this. It was definitely necessary for Exodia to get nerfed right the heck out of this tournament, or else there would be literally no tension. Anytime Yugi needed to win and Takahashi couldn't think of a reason for him to get out of the situation he was in, boom, Exodia, right? And so my problem isn't that Haga does this, that it's out of character for him within the context of this chapter or anything, because I don't think it is. He's written with a lot of nuance here. And it makes sense that Yugi would be so angry with him going into the tournament, since this isn't just a tournament for him. He's trying to save his grandfather, something that he would sound absolutely insane if he told anybody about, so he just can't tell anybody about it, right? My problem, though, is that Haga's never written with this amount of nuance again. Like, the anime is more egregious when it comes to this kind of thing than the manga is. He's written as a straight-up, late into the arc villain in one of the later arcs of the anime that isn't in the manga. But even in just the second tournament arc of the manga, the Battle City arc, Haga is written as a D-grade villain who cheats on the regular. And I just don't think that fits with his characterization here. I kind of wish that he had been written with as much nuance as he was written with here in all of his future appearances. It would have made him so much more interesting. Still, despite my problems with these 5 chapters, this is a really effective introduction to this arc. It catches us up on all of the pertinent information from prior arcs. It catches us up on the main story mechanic of the arc, that being Duel Monsters and the duels that Duel Monsters as a concept allows the characters to play out. It introduces us to our arc villain, and it gives us a feel for some of the other antagonists that the characters are going to have to deal with, and it sets up that brilliant plot device centered around the star chips and the admission cards. I love it a lot, despite its many problems, and I do think there are a lot of problems here. I do think that if it weren't for the few things that this introduction to the arc does super, super well, it would be a pretty weak 5 chapters. All of that said, though, guys, if you have read these few introductory chapters to the Duelist Kingdom arc of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Manga, what do you think of them? Let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below, or over on my Discord, link in the description. Also, while you're down there, be sure to check the description. The top 2 links in the description are links for you to purchase that book I've been talking about all over the place, which is something that you should definitely do. Either way, though, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.